keynote speaker is John Bryant, and as I said, he has been involved with the project for a long time. John is professor of English at Hofstra University, and he is, an amazing scholar who, on the one hand, yes. Sorry, you can sit down again. You think I will go on?
We're done. We're done.
Right, exactly. You don't have to say anything. Yeah. So, his research focuses on the one hand on 19th century American literature and culture, and in particular the works of Herman Melville. And he's the editor of the Melville Electronic Library, or the director of Melville Electronic Library. And he has been involved also in many aspects of developing digital tools, and you'll see them in a moment, that think about also getting a better access at the actual writing process of the authors, the different stages, and how scholars can actually read that in different ways. So, that's part of his textual studies and digital scholarship, where he's also paying special attention to how writers and readers revise texts, making them into what he calls fluid texts. And this is also the title of one of his books, The Fluid Text, that came out at Michigan University Press. He has published a number of books. One is also Melville and the Repose. He's also edited and published a Longman critical edition of Moby Dick. And he's also the editor of Leviathan, a journal of Melville studies. And I already mentioned he's director of the Melville Electronic Library. So, without further ado, please welcome John Bryant.
Thank you, Kurt, for that warm welcome. I'm just going to reinsert here, and I hope I have. I think this is going to be. I think we have to turn it on. It has to warm up a little bit. Electricity at MIT is slow. I think we're all going to be learning a lot today. I've already learned something. I did not know that there was a science genre of tattoo. But later in the afternoon, Jim, I can share with you my tattoo, which my wife and I got in Hawaii 10 years ago when we were drunk at a Melville conference, which is please join the Melville Society. We have a good time, and there are people in the audience who know that I'm not joking. I'd like to thank Jim for your opening and for all the work that you're doing with HyperStudio. Kurt Fent and Jamie Folsom have over the years now been extremely generous in helping me at Hofstra and others in Melville Society, or in Melville Electronic Library, but also at Hofstra's Digital Research Center, and getting us off the ground and moving forward. I'd also like to thank two other people who are in the program, Wynn Kelly and Esna Lay, both of whom I have known for several years, and in Wynn's case, almost a lifetime. And I'm highly indebted to their collegiality and friendship, and you'll be able to get to know them later on this afternoon as well. Kurt asked me as part of the keynote to lay out some theoretical foundations for annotation. And before you rush to the door and retreat, let me tell you, I paid no attention to Kurt Fent. Mostly I do pay attention to Kurt Fent, but in this case, I think I've moved beyond it. So I'm calling this the voices of annotation, critical thinking in the margins of the digital text. I've been asked to introduce our workshop on HyperStudio's Annotation Studio, and I want to start by asking some fundamental questions and conclude with some more pragmatic considerations. What is annotation? Why is it such a compelling activity, at least for us, maybe not for our students, but we'll get them there? How does it relate to writing and reading? Is it not just a form of marginal doodling? Or is it an act of critical thinking intrinsic to the processes of reading and writing? And finally, how might this ancient humanistic art of marginal inscription continue on in a digital age where screens notoriously have no margins at all? When we think of annotation as a part of our regular reading experience, we usually think of the footnotes or endnotes that adorn fussy editions of certain books, such as our college texts. Let me demonstrate. Here is my college text of Moby Dick. I don't know. Can you hear me when I stand like, okay. I graduated in 1971, and this has been with me ever since. And some decades ago, it disintegrated as I took it into teaching. Now here's a page with explanatory notes of this edition at the bottom of the page, and you'll also notice, not surprisingly, marginal notes of my own, mostly tracking ideas in Melville's text. Most pages are marked up, representing successive readings and rereadings with notes in different pencils and ink. I'm sure you have the same kind of book in your library. My copy of the standard scholarly edition, the Northwestern Newberry edition of Moby Dick, is here, and it contains it's a critical edition which contains a fulsome textual apparatus. The apparatus is itself a massive set of indispensable scholarly annotations, and this whole page is a set of annotations, and you can also see that I have elaborated them with my own annotations. What then is annotation? Our first thought is probably that annotation is an afterthought or explanation or merely an expression of delight or confusion or a link to some other text on some other page. But more to the point, it is our interaction with the given text already in front of us, inside the margins, an originating text that is always asking to be read, embraced, and understood. In fact, it seems that in the evolution of print technology, printers for centuries have graciously supplied us with margins that serve as a boundary between writer and reader, margins wherein we, as readers, are invited to inscribe thoughts and reactions of our own. Annotation, then, is first of all a form of inscription, defined not so much by what it says as by where it appears. We know an annotation instantly before we read it because there it is in the margins, our space, a place where readers become writers. We recognize annotation as a kind of text by the place in which it is positioned. Its textual identity is determined by its position in the margin, and the marginal positioning telegraphs to us the annotation's special character. It exists in relation to its target text and in relation to the reader. Because of this extraspatial paratextual relation, we tend to, and I apologize for using paratextual, I will never do that again. In this, that's the end of it. Because of this paratextual relation, well, there I go, I did it again. We tend to devalue annotation. It is not the target text we desire to, it's not the target text which is what we desire to know. Rather, it is merely incidental scribbling to mark or explain the text. That is, we marginalize annotation in our critical interpretation, even though traditions of annotation from medieval and even earlier biblical transcriptions dating back to the 1st century BC lay remarkable claim to its legitimacy as an intellectual uh, object of study. In these instances, what is marginal contributes indelibly to the vibrancy and meaning of a target text, transmitted from one era and one set of readers down to those of the present. Moreover, it records the act of reading. We call such annotation marginalia, but a more critically integrative approach would be to call it a framing text, because like a frame surrounding a picture, the annotations draw our eye away from the target text and yet back into it. And thus, as a specialized form of reader inscription, annotation creates a reading dynamic that is inherently critical and therefore deserves attention in the study of reader response. Now, so far, I've argued that annotation has its own textual identity due to its position in the margins and its place as a frame for the target text. But already implicit in my discussion of the dynamic of reader and writer within this identity is that annotation is a voice, or more precisely, the expression of a voice of the reader. And here we can again see a single reader's annotations made over several decades, and the different annotations represent different moments in that reader's lifelong reading. One person, but in fact, many voices. We see then the growth of a reader. Generally speaking, such annotation is a unitary and private process. That is, we find one reader in the margin. But in some annotated books, such as monastic inscriptions of manuscripts, we can see multiple readers making their marks. Although, to my knowledge, the phenomenon of annotation representing multiple readers is relatively rare, we can imagine how digital technology might encourage collaborative annotation. And today's workshop will show just what that might look like. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What seems a clear potential of the idea of annotation as a voice is that multi-voiced annotations residing in the frame of a single target text are the beginnings of a critical community. What remains to be seen is how this community can grow self-consciously and self-critically, how its life can be valorized, and how its textual identity can be sustained in relation to the separate textual identity of the target text. With our focus on Annotation Studio, I think you all know where I'm going with these ideas regarding inscription, target and frame identities, voice, and community. And I would like to get back to community, but not until my conclusion. But to do that, I need to take another step and argue that annotation is also a kind of revision. As you can see, revision looks annotative, but then again, it seems like much more. Here too, the process is collaborative, as the typescript of President Obama's address was partly written by speechwriter John Favreau before the president made his revisions. Several hands have squired this text through several versions. And to explain how revision is a kind of annotation, I need to explain how annotation participates in the phenomenon of what I call the fluid text. And what you see there is a pretty messy fluid text. A fluid text is any written work that exists in multiple versions due to one or another form of revision, authorial, editorial, and adaptive. That is, writers will revise as they write and after they publish. Editors will make changes with or without the writer's consent, and translators and adapters will transform a text into another language, another genre, another medium. Billy Budd is a perfect example of a text that is heavily revised in manuscript, significantly different in its 20th century editions, because each scholar that produced a new edition was going back to the same unpublished manuscript and reading it differently. And it appears as a play, film, and an opera. Annotation strikes me as a kind of adaptive revision. With adaptation, we have the phenomenon of readers so taken with a target text that they want to possess it and remake it. Invariably, the remaking creates a version that represents the adaptive reader's interpretation of the target text. But it is, but annotation is more intimate than critical in this case. The adapter seeks a certain control over the target text and bends the original to make it over into his or her image. I'm speaking now of regular adaptations, not annotations. While annotation is not a full adaptation, it nevertheless shares in the intimacy of adaptive revision. The annotation will restate a target text. It will select texts that, for the reader, have particular importance, that rise above the unmarked texts. It will argue with the text or agree with it. It will link the target text to other texts. In this sense, annotation is a part of a revision process going on inside the mind of a reader. A good example of this kind of annotative revising can be seen in Melville's Marginalia in one of his major source books for Moby Dick, Thomas Beale's Natural History of the Sperm Whale. Here you see in the bottom margin Melville's commentary on the ineptitude of the middle image of a sperm whale breaching. This is the, and you can see he's sort of nailed it there. Later on in Moby Dick, he refers to other representations of sperm whales as more like a sow than an actual whale. But here we see in Melville's annotation that this is the skeptical voice of one who has seen whales in person and knows the difference. But Melville also praises Beale's language, especially when it rises out of scientific reportage into something swelling or ground swelling, as he says, toward the poetic. Somehow Beale actually got turned on by writing about whales and started writing poetically. And this is the aesthetic voice of Melville in the margin of a voice of one who is himself swelling into the poetic as he reads Beale and as he is composing Moby Dick. Melville also speaks in the voice of the social critic. Here, his annotation has been erased but recovered by Stephen Olson Smith for display in his important website, Melville Marginalia Online. Melville has earmarked Beale's discussion of whaling's impact on world history as preceding imperialist nations, such as Spain, in their colonization and conquest and colonization of the Pacific. His erased annotation simply reads, somewhat sarcastically, the dignity of whaling. I think a good question, an interesting question, is why these annotations have been erased and some left. It may not have been Melville who did the erasing, but nevertheless, it's there for us to consider. Melville develops this annotative utterance, the dignity of whaling, in The Advocate, chapter 24 of Moby Dick. While Melville co-opts and in fact plagiarizes specific words from Beale's praise of imperialism, he also rewrites Beale into a less enthused, more critical assessment of Pacific imperialism. In effect, Melville revises Beale in Moby Dick. He makes Beale's text over in his own image and in his own voice, which is what I call adaptive revision. So that we might say that in chapter 24, Melville has created his own version of Beale. My point here is that annotation plays a vital role in Melville's creative process. Reading Beale's triggers Melville's annotation of Beale, which triggers an adaptive revision that refashions Beale into Melville's secretly subversive version of Beale, which forms an integral part of Moby Dick. Here, I am saying that annotation is a form of revision. Let me also venture a step further and say that revision is conversely a form of annotation. Take a look at a leaf from Melville's manuscript of Billy Budd. Here, Melville has initially characterized Billy as a kind of sailor that is racially determined as a white forecastle magnate. And you can see these words lined out in the box above. Those were the original words that he wrote on this leaf. But he later deracializes this sailor type by deleting and inserting words to create a new expression, handsome sailor. As we look at this revision site and the others on the leaf, we see words added in the margins, words squeezed between other words, and words inserted between lines. While these layered replacement inscriptions are meant to change the text, not comment on it, the revisions are an enactment of the reviser's otherwise unarticulated critical thinking. It's all in his head, but all you can see are the scratches and scribblings that he's put on the page. That is, a deletion is essentially the writer's comment to himself. I don't want this word. This word is not right. It does not fit. I have my reasons to delete it, but I will let the revision speak for itself. Scratch. An insertion implies another kind of unspoken self-commentary. Maybe this word will work, maybe not. Let's see. While I may be pushing the boundary of what, quote, true annotation is, let's recall that annotation is a reader's conversation with a writer's text. But if a writer is his own first reader, why can't the writer, as a self-reader, converse with her own text? The problem is that a revision site doesn't look like a conventional marginal annotation. It is an act of writing in itself. But you'll notice that revisions are delivered to us through revision codes that compress a great deal of information involving word choice and the sequencing of those choices. Deletions are fossils that suggest textual evolution, and insertions replace older words, and therefore they have a linguistic genealogy. Revision codes must be decoded by giving full articulation to each step in the revision sequence. Like evolution, the undecoded revision process is essentially invisible until editors transform the codes to make the full revision text visible. And editors perform this transformation through a form of annotation. Let me demonstrate. In this revision scenario, Melville first deletes the word white. I've sort of doctored the inset there by taking out handsome sailor. I couldn't take out the cross out but you have to sort of imagine that what he first wrote was the white forecastle magnate. He couldn't fit forecastle magnate to the right of the word white, so he put it all, he was on good behavior. Now, you can actually read these words. Most of Melville's handwriting is impenetrable, but you can sort of make out that, so he put this hyphenated word on a new line by itself. And so imagine now that he then first takes a pen and marks out the word white, and then forecastle magnate in two virtually simultaneous strokes. And then he squeezes handsome sailor into the right margin. It seems simple enough. And in each of these steps, I have provided actual wording represented by the deletion and insertion revision codes that you see there. These steps also require some sort of revision narration or narrative that argues for each step. But the problem with revision is that these steps are only one hypothesis for how Melville might have revised. In a second possible revision scenario, Melville follows a different sequence. Here, instead of deleting the word white first, he actually holds on to white until the end. He first inserts handsome in the margin to give white handsome forecastle magnate. And then in two quick moves, he deletes forecastle magnate and squeezes sailor after handsome to give white handsome sailor. Only in the final step of this sequence does Melville delete white. Now, there's more to this story than I have time to tell, but I think you can see that this is a kind of provocative moment in the revision of Billy Budd. The racializing and deracializing that's going on here on the page. It's quite fascinating. So far, we've seen how annotation's textual identity evolves from marginal inscription to voices in the frame, how revision codes conceal authorial annotations, and how the silenced voice of revision can be given voice through fluid text annotation. You might say then that annotation is a textual representation of the thinking we do when we read and when we write. If so, what remains is inventing a new field of study that will make us more aware of the critical nature of annotation. Call it annotation studies. And what better place to perform this new field of study than in something called Annotation Studio? How can this digital tool facilitate annotation studies? Let me answer first from my own experience in preparing fluid text editions for the Melville Electronic Library, or MEL. In order to edit revision for Mel's edition of Billy Budd manuscript, a team of programmers, much smarter than I, created a tool called TextLab. TextLab not only transcribes Melville's text and revision texts, but also generates a reading text to which are added annotations in the form of revision sequences and revision narratives. When readers enter Mel and select the versions of Billy Budd edition, they first come to a reading text. TextLab generates this version in the final reading of the manuscript by automatically deleting all deletions and inserting all insertions. Now, this is all coded behind the scenes, and I don't have time to show you, under the hood, which is kind of interesting in itself. But all of this is coded in TEI and sits underneath there, and an XSLT program generates this reading text. And we are already in the process of making this a prettier and more critical edition phase in present programming developments for TextLab. In other words, we're getting it better. In this case, you can mouse over the thumbnail of a given leaf, and that highlights the text associated with that leaf. By double-clicking the thumbnail, you are taken to a larger manuscript image on the left and its diplomatic transcription on the right, which is a typographical simulation of the manuscript leaf. That too is also generated on the fly from another XSLT um, um, reading the TEI code. Users will also find underlined in green those revision sites for which revision sequences and narratives have been approved for display. When you click on any green revision site, a list of sequences pops up. And when you click on an item in that list, the full revision sequence and narrative appears in a pop-up. Let me be clear that the middle column are the steps that you saw done by hand earlier. To the right, in the right column, is the narration, and this is a uh, an explanation. I'll talk a little bit about more of what's going on in each step. TextLab also allows us to compare multiple sequences, such as the two demonstrated earlier, thus enabling further discourse on how and why Melville deracialized his handsome sailor. The principal aim of TextLab is to edit revision in such a way as to create a discourse field about revision that did not exist before. TextLab enables the reader to annotate a revision site by generating as many revision sequences and narratives as good logic and argumentation will allow. Thus far, it remains for the user of the edition to line up one sequence next to another, and you can fill the screen with as many as exist, 6, 8, however many. But it remains for you, the reader, to kind of line them up next to another in order to compare the different hypotheses of how Melville revised his white forecastle magnate into a handsome sailor. What is needed is a way to import these revision annotations from TextLab into a modified version of Annotation Studio that will allow the user to annotate the variant revision annotations. So we're already getting into let's annotate the annotations, which is what people have been doing for centuries anyway. And this is only fitting because annotation by its own nature is a self-consciously critical discourse between frame and target text. As a discourse field, annotation is therefore the textual enactment of a community of writers reading and revising, and of readers writing and revising. Let me get that again. As a discourse field, annotation is the textual enactment of a community of writers reading and revising, and of readers writing and revising. Happily, we're on our way. That's the happiest thing I've seen today. Happily, we are on our way toward realizing a fuller embodiment of this vision of a discourse field. Programmer Nick Licona and his staff at Performance Software have been working to, and not cheaply, have been working to implement this data flowchart that includes Annotation Studio as a workspace for annotating MEL texts. With Annotation Studio technology, I don't know if you can read the chart. It takes a while, but I've tried to circle the juicy bits for us today. But TextLab is over to the left, and you move things through another gizmo that we have done, which is called MELCat, or the MEL catalog. And those move to both a further editorial space going below or up into a more public space using Annotation Studio. With Annotation Studio technology, we're able to upload images, apply metadata to those images. Also, you can upload images of texts and regular text as well, and provide contextual annotations for MEL text and images. And this is our version, our text lab version, or our MEL version of Annotation Studio. We hoovered up their code and with help, and tinkered with it. And I'm sort of hoping that this might be a kind of example for what you can take back, so that you can steal the code from Kurt and do whatever you want with it as well. I think he's inviting you to do that, by the way, at absolutely no cost to the taxpayer. Well. So we're gathered here today to share our experiences and ideas about the process of annotation from the perspective of the writer and of the reader, and to consider some practical extensions of this tool. For instance, at Hofstra's Digital Research Center, we are shaping Annotation Studio to include color coding and other means of thematic tagging that will enable readers in Hofstra's law school to more clearly analyze the role of evidence in the logical structures of legal texts. Annotation Studio has yet to create an adaptation that will make sense of the law, but you can see the logic that they use. Annotation Studio is a profoundly simple tool. I don't mean that as a derogation. That's what gives it its flexibility and viability. And it is beckoning us to find new ways to use it and to adapt it further to the needs of writers and readers. Might Annotation Studio be used to assist creative writers in testing their work on readers? Can we encourage editors of standard anthologies to create pedagogical opportunities by putting selected works online as target texts to be researched in Annotation Studio? We already know that multiple users can work together as a community to annotate a single text, but can Annotation Studio be extended so that one annotation can be linked to another annotation within Annotation Studio, and thus creating more of a sense of a network of cross-references? Well, we have the rest of the day to contemplate the uses of annotation. But to conclude, I feel that our chief challenge is to find applications that familiarize the act of annotation so that it may transform the passive reading of conventional academe into something new, powerful, and interactive. Annotation is not a marginal pastime, nor is it simply a means to advance scholarship or even to enrich our reading. It is an act of discovering a deeper humanity in ourselves. For annotators are seekers. They make connections, ask questions, interpret texts, consider consequences. Annotators create new worlds of thought. Thanks.